The morning fog clung to the glass towers of downtown San Francisco like a shroud of forgotten dreams, each droplet catching the amber light of dawn and transforming the city into something ethereal, something deceptive. From the 42nd floor of the Blackwood Industries headquarters, the world below seemed small, manageable, conquerable. But in the basement servants' quarters of a Nob Hill penthouse, where the fog never quite reached and the light never quite penetrated, Elena Vasquez pressed her weathered hands against the small window and watched that same sun struggle to break through the gloom. The alarm clock's shrill cry had pierced the darkness at 4:30 a.m., as it had every morning for the past 18 months. Elena's fingers found the button with practiced precision, silencing it before the sound could travel through the thin walls and disturb the household above. Her movements were economical, honed by necessity and exhaustion, each gesture calculated to preserve energy she could not afford to waste. The basement room smelled of industrial bleach and fabric softener, a cocktail of cleaning chemicals that had become as familiar as her own breath. The scent clung to her clothes, her hair, her dreams. It was the perfume of invisibility, the cologne of the overlooked. She dressed in the same navy uniform she wore every day, pressed, spotless, a uniform that erased her identity as surely as if it were a costume in a play where she had forgotten her lines. But Elena remembered everything. Her mind was a cathedral of languages, each tongue a different colored window through which the light of human understanding could enter. Spanish, her mother tongue, warm and flowing like honey over bread. English, precise and necessary, the language of survival in this country that had promised her family so much. Mandarin, with its tonal complexities that required her to think in music. Arabic, flowing like calligraphy across her consciousness. French, elegant and romantic, the language in which she had first said, "I love you," to Miguel. Miguel. Even his name brought a tightness to her chest, a familiar ache that had become her constant companion. Dr. Miguel Vasquez, brilliant computer scientist, loving husband, devoted father. Gone now for 2 years, 4 months and 16 days. Not that she was counting, not that every sunrise reminded her that he would never see another dawn, never hold their daughter Sophia again, never whisper to Elena in the early morning darkness that everything would be all right. The medical bills had come like vultures after his funeral, circling and diving until they had picked clean everything they had built together. The house in Palo Alto, sold. The savings account, emptied. Miguel's research, his patents, his revolutionary translation algorithms, all of it had somehow disappeared into the legal machinery that surrounded his former business partner's meteoric rise to fortune. Elena pulled on her cleaning gloves, the latex snapping against her wrists like small defeats. Above her head, she could hear the familiar sounds of the Blackwood household awakening, the hiss of the imported Italian espresso machine, the whisper of Egyptian cotton sheets being thrown back, the soft padding of feet on Persian rugs that cost more than Elena made in 6 months. Marcus Blackwood lived in a world where money spoke the only language that mattered. His penthouse was a testament to excess, each room designed not for comfort, but for display. The living room stretched 30 feet from wall to wall, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Bay Area that made visitors feel simultaneously elevated and diminished. The furniture was museum quality, pieces that had never been truly used, only admired. Even the kitchen, with its gleaming copper surfaces and restaurant-grade appliances, remained largely untouched. Marcus Blackwood was a man who consumed rather than created, who acquired rather than appreciated. The air in the penthouse carried the scent of expensive leather and electronic ozone from the countless devices that hummed throughout the space. Smart home systems that controlled everything from lighting to temperature to security. Tablets and phones and laptops scattered across every surface like digital confetti, and prominently displayed in every room, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, were examples of his revolutionary Babel Bridge translation app. Screens that cycled through demonstrations of the software's capabilities, awards and accolades celebrating his democratization of global communication, marketing materials that proclaimed the death of human translators and the birth of a new age of technological understanding. Elena had learned to move through this space like a ghost, present but unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. She knew the routine by heart. Start with the main bathroom, Marcus's personal sanctuary with its rainfall shower and heated marble floors. Dust the awards in his home office, being careful not to disturb the perfectly arranged chaos of his desk. Vacuum the living room, working around the expensive furniture with the same care a curator might show, handling priceless artifacts. But the real work, the work that mattered, happened in the spaces between her duties. In the quiet moments when she could hear Marcus conducting his business calls, speaking in the confident tones of a man who believed the world revolved around his vision. He spoke often of disrupting industries, of making human expertise obsolete, of creating a future where technology would eliminate the need for what he called inefficient human intermediaries. The future doesn't need translators, she had heard him say to an investor just last week, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls of her basement room. My app can translate 57 languages in real time. Why pay for some over-educated polyglot when you can get perfect translation for 99 cents a month? Perfect translation. Elena almost smiled at the arrogance. She had spent her career, her real career, the one that seemed like another lifetime now, navigating the infinite complexity of human communication. She had sat in rooms where the wrong translation of a single word could mean the difference between peace and war. She had seen diplomats struggle to convey not just the literal meaning of their words, but the cultural context, the emotional subtext, the delicate nuances that no algorithm could capture. At the United Nations, she had been Dr. Elena Vasquez, simultaneous interpreter for the Security Council. She had been the invisible voice that allowed world leaders to understand each other, the bridge across linguistic divides that could reshape international relations. She had interpreted for presidents and prime ministers, for Nobel laureates and revolutionary leaders. Her voice had carried the weight of nations. Now she carried a bucket and mop. The irony was not lost on her. Marcus Blackwood, who had built his fortune on the promise of perfect translation, lived alone in his Tower of Babel, understanding only one language, the crude dialect of wealth and power. He surrounded himself with the finest things money could buy, but remained fundamentally isolated, cut off from the rich tapestry of human experience that came from truly connecting across cultures and languages. As Elena climbed the narrow stairs from the basement to begin her daily duties, she carried with her more than cleaning supplies. In her pocket was a small photograph of Sophia at her high school graduation, valedictorian smile, bright with hope and possibility. In her mind were the voices of her parents, who had sacrificed everything to bring their family to America, who had cleaned offices and picked fruit and worked double shifts so their daughter could have opportunities they never imagined. And in her heart, carefully guarded but never forgotten, was the memory of Miguel's last words to her in the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and failing dreams. "Promise me," he had whispered, his hand weak in hers, "that you'll never let them make you invisible. You are brilliant, Elena. You are capable of changing the world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She had promised. And 18 months of scrubbing toilets and dusting awards had not changed that promise, only refined it, sharpened it like a blade being honed for a purpose she was only beginning to understand. The penthouse morning light filtered through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Soon, Marcus Blackwood would emerge from his bedroom, check his phone for overnight messages from investors and partners around the globe, and begin another day of building his empire on the foundation of other people's genius. He would speak confidently about markets he had never visited, cultures he had never experienced, languages he had never bothered to learn. and Elena would be there, invisible as always, listening to every word, understanding everything. The stage was set. The players were in position, and in the basement of a Nob Hill penthouse, a woman who had once prevented wars with the power of her voice was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming. The fog was beginning to lift from the city below, and with it, Elena Vasquez was about to remember exactly who she used to be, and who she was meant to become. The smell of café con leche and fresh bread drifted through Elena's memory as she polished the marble countertops of Marcus Blackwood's kitchen, her movements automatic while her mind traveled backward through time, to a small apartment in East San Jose where love had lived in every cramped corner, where 3 languages mixed like spices in her mother's cooking, and where dreams had been carefully cultivated in window boxes that caught the morning sun. Elena paused, her cloth stilling on the pristine surface that had never known the chaos of family meals. In her pocket, her fingers found the worn edges of a letter. The last piece of paper Miguel had touched, creased from years of handling, ink faded, but words still burning bright. She didn't need to unfold it to remember every syllable. It was written in his careful handwriting, a mixture of Spanish endearments and English technical terms, the bilingual poetry of their shared life. Mi amor, if you are reading this, then the doctors were right, and I was too stubborn to listen. But I need you to know something I should have told you when I was strong enough to fight for it. The letter had been hidden in his research papers, discovered only after the lawyers had finished dividing their life into billable hours and court documents. But this morning, as she cleaned the house of the man who had stolen Miguel's life's work, the weight of those words felt heavier than usual. 25 years earlier, Elena had been a different person entirely. At 22, she stood in the cramped living room of her parents' apartment, her Universidad de Barcelona linguistics degree clutched in trembling hands, while her mother, Carmen, pressed warm tortillas into her palms and whispered prayers in rapid Spanish. "Mija," Carmen had said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's sacrifices. "Your father and I, we clean offices so you could study words. We picked strawberries in Salinas so you could learn languages. Now you take our dreams with you to that big building with all the flags, and you make us proud." The apartment had been a symphony of struggles and triumphs. Elena's father, Roberto, worked the night shift at a janitorial service, coming home each morning with stories of the important people whose offices he cleaned, lawyers and doctors and businessmen who never noticed the man who emptied their trash cans, but who spoke 4 languages and had once been a teacher in Mexico City. Roberto would sit at their small kitchen table, still in his uniform, and quiz Elena on her French conjugations, while Carmen prepared his breakfast with hands that smelled of industrial soap and determination. The walls of their home had been covered with Elena's achievements, report cards with perfect grades, certificates from language competitions, a photograph of her receiving the Outstanding Student Award from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, her parents flanking her in their best clothes, Roberto in a suit that was slightly too large, Carmen in a dress she had sewn herself from fabric bought on sale at the Mission District Mercado. But the centerpiece of their modest shrine to education had been Elena's acceptance letter to the United Nations Interpreter Training Program. The official UN letterhead had seemed impossibly grand in their small living room, the formal language of international diplomacy sitting incongruously next to Carmen's collection of ceramic roosters and Roberto's carefully tended plants on the windowsill. "Read it again, mija," Carmen would ask visitors, her voice swelling with pride. "Read how they say Elena is exceptionally gifted and has demonstrated mastery of linguistic precision rarely seen in candidates of her age." Dame. Elena remembered the weight of their expectations, the beautiful burden of being the first in her family to graduate from university, the first to work in an office instead of cleaning one. She remembered practicing her simultaneous interpretation skills by listening to Spanish radio while translating into English for her parents, turning their evening news into a trilingual experience that made their small apartment feel connected to the wider world. The UN years had been a golden time. Elena would call her parents from New York, describing the marble halls and important meetings, the delegates from countries they had only seen on maps, the moment when her voice became the bridge between nations. Roberto would put her on speakerphone during his dinner break at work, and Elena would tell stories of interpreting for heads of state while her father ate Carmen's homemade tamales in the break room of an office building in downtown San Jose. Today, I helped a Japanese diplomat explain his country's position on trade policy to the Russian ambassador, she might say, and Roberto would shake his head in wonder, telling his co-workers, "My daughter, she speaks for presidents." It was during her third year at the UN that Elena met Miguel at a conference on artificial intelligence and language processing. He had been presenting his research on neural translation networks, his passion for the intersection of technology and human communication evident in every gesture, every carefully chosen word. After his presentation, she had approached him in her professional capacity, offering to help refine his algorithms with insights from human interpretation. Their first conversation had lasted 6 hours, conducted in 3 languages, as they discovered shared dreams of bridging cultural divides through better communication. Miguel spoke of technology that could preserve endangered languages, of programs that could help immigrants navigate complex systems in their adopted countries. Elena spoke of the irreplaceable human elements of translation, the cultural context, the emotional subtext, the way a perfectly translated sentence could still miss the heart of what someone was trying to say. Technology should enhance human connection, not replace it, Miguel had said that night over coffee that had long grown cold. I want to build something that makes human translators more powerful, not obsolete. They had fallen in love in 4 languages, their courtship a beautiful dance of Spanish intimacy, English practicality, French romance, and Portuguese poetry. Miguel would leave her notes in Mandarin, challenging her to translate his expressions of affection. Elena would respond in Italian, their relationship becoming a linguistic adventure that delighted them both. Their wedding had been a celebration of 2 worlds coming together. Roberto had walked Elena down the aisle of a small church in the Mission District, tears streaming down his face as he whispered in Spanish, "Today you marry a man who sees your mind, not just your beauty. This is what your mother and I prayed for." Carmen had spent months hand-embroidering Elena's wedding dress with tiny flowers that represented all the countries where her daughter had worked: Mexican roses, Japanese cherry blossoms, French lavender. Miguel's family, computer scientists and engineers who had immigrated from Venezuela, had embraced Elena with the warmth reserved for someone who understood the immigrant experience. His mother, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a retired mathematics professor, had given Elena a family heirloom, a gold locket that had belonged to Miguel's great-grandmother, a poet who had written in Spanish and English during the early days of the Mexican Revolution. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of Isabella as a young woman, and inscribed on the back, in Spanish, were the words, "Para la mujer que guarda las palabras de nuestro corazón," for the woman who keeps the words of our heart. When Sophia was born, their small family had become a linguistic laboratory of love. Miguel would sing programming songs in English while changing diapers. Elena would read bedtime stories in Spanish, French, and Portuguese, watching their daughter's eyes widen with delight at the musical differences in each language. Sophia's first words had been mama, papa, and código, the last because Miguel was always talking about writing code, and their precocious daughter had picked up his professional vocabulary along with standard baby talk. The San Francisco apartment they had shared during Sophia's early years had been filled with the warm chaos of intellectual partnership and young parenthood. Miguel's computers hummed in the corner, while Elena's translation dictionaries created towering stacks on every available surface. Their refrigerator had been covered with Sophia's artwork, crayon drawings of families labeled in multiple languages, stick figures holding hands under suns that smiled in universal joy. It was in this period of contentment that Miguel had developed his breakthrough translation algorithms. Working late into the night while Elena reviewed UN documents and Sophia slept peacefully in her crib, Miguel had created something revolutionary, a program that didn't just translate words, but attempted to capture cultural context and emotional nuance. "Look at this, Elena," he had said one evening, his excitement barely contained as he showed her his latest breakthrough. "I've figured out how to incorporate cultural databases into the translation matrix. The program doesn't just know that saudade means longing in Portuguese. It understands that saudade represents a specifically Portuguese emotional concept that has no direct English equivalent." Elena had been amazed by Miguel's work, and more importantly, by his approach. Unlike other technologists who viewed human translators as obstacles to progress, Miguel saw them as essential partners. His dream was to create tools that would amplify human insight, not replace human intuition. "Every language carries the soul of its people," he had told her, holding Sophia while explaining his vision. "Technology should honor that soul, not try to digitize it into ones and zeros." When Marcus Blackwood first approached Miguel about partnering with his startup, it had seemed like the perfect collaboration. Marcus had praised Miguel's vision, spoken eloquently about the potential for their combined efforts to democratize global communication. He had presented himself as a humanitarian entrepreneur, someone who shared Miguel's dream of breaking down language barriers to bring the world closer together. "We can change everything," Marcus had said during their first meeting, his enthusiasm infectious. "Your algorithms, my business acumen, our shared vision, we can create something that helps millions of people understand each other better." Miguel had been cautious at first, but Marcus's apparent commitment to ethical technology development had won him over. They had signed partnership agreements that promised Miguel significant equity in any resulting company, guarantees that his humanitarian vision would drive product development, and assurances that human translators would always be central to their business model. The early months of their collaboration had been productive and hopeful. Miguel would come home excited about their progress, describing Marcus as a true partner who understood the deeper mission of their work. Elena had met Marcus several times at company social events, finding him charming if somewhat superficial, but apparently committed to Miguel's vision of technology serving humanity rather than replacing it. Then, Miguel had gotten sick. The cancer had appeared suddenly, aggressively, transforming their life of careful planning into a desperate race against time. Miguel's focus shifted from algorithms to medical appointments, from partnership meetings to chemotherapy sessions. Marcus had been supportive initially, visiting Miguel in the hospital and assuring him that his position in the company was secure regardless of his health status. But as Miguel's condition worsened, Marcus's visits became less frequent. Business decisions that had previously been collaborative became unilateral. The company's messaging began shifting away from Miguel's humanitarian vision toward a more commercially aggressive stance that emphasized replacing human translators entirely. "He's changing everything we discussed," Miguel had told Elena weekly from his hospital bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The patents, the company's structure, even the core mission. He says it's just temporary, just while I focus on getting better, but..." Miguel had died before he could complete the legal challenges necessary to protect his intellectual property. In the chaos of grief and medical bills that followed, Elena had been overwhelmed by the complexity of corporate law and intellectual property rights. The lawyers Marcus recommended had been helpful but ineffective, seeming more interested in settling quickly than in protecting Miguel's interests. Within 6 months of Miguel's death, Babelbridge had launched with great fanfare, hailed as Marcus Blackwood's revolutionary contribution to global communication. Miguel's name appeared nowhere in the company's origin story. His algorithms had been absorbed into Marcus's corporate machine and rebranded as proprietary technology developed exclusively by Blackwood Industries. Elena had tried to fight, had hired her own lawyer with the little money remaining from their savings. But Marcus's legal team had been formidable, and the contracts Miguel had signed in good faith had contained clauses that protected the company's interests more thoroughly than they protected the inventor's legacy. The final blow had come when Elena was forced to sell their house to pay Miguel's medical bills. Sophia had cried as they packed their belongings, not understanding why they had to leave the only home she remembered. Elena had held her daughter close, whispering promises in Spanish and English that everything would be all right, that they would find a new home, that Daddy's work would not be forgotten. But finding work as a UN interpreter required being in New York, and Elena could not afford to maintain an apartment there while also supporting Sophia in California. The gap in her resume created by Miguel's illness and death had made her less competitive for the few positions available. Gradually, her savings had dwindled, her options had narrowed, and she had been forced to accept whatever work she could find. The first cleaning job had been meant to be temporary, just until she could get back on her feet, just until she could figure out how to reclaim her professional life. But temporary had stretched into months, and months into years, and somewhere along the way, Elena had realized that she had become invisible in plain sight, a ghost haunting the margins of the world she had once helped to shape. Standing now in Marcus Blackwood's kitchen, polishing surfaces that gleamed with the reflection of stolen success, Elena felt the weight of her parents' dreams and Miguel's legacy pressing against her chest like a physical force. Carmen and Roberto had died within months of each other during Elena's second year of cleaning houses, never knowing that their daughter's fall from grace had been orchestrated by the very man who had once praised her husband's genius. In her pocket, Miguel's letter crinkled as she moved, its final lines echoing in her memory. I hid copies of everything in the place only you would think to look. The algorithms, the patents, the email correspondence, it's all there. Promise me you'll use it when the time is right. Promise me you won't let them erase what we built together. Elena had found the hidden files exactly where Miguel had said they would be, in a folder labeled Para Elena, within their shared digital photo album, disguised among thousands of family pictures, technical documents, and legal correspondence that told the true story of Babelbridge's creation, evidence that would restore Miguel's reputation and expose Marcus's theft. But she had waited. She had waited through grief and poverty and humiliation, knowing that she would have only one chance to make things right, one moment when the truth would matter more than corporate lawyers and expensive legal strategies. As she heard Marcus's footsteps overhead, beginning his morning routine in blissful ignorance of the woman who cleaned his floors and knew all his secrets, Elena touched the letter in her pocket one more time and whispered a promise in Spanish to her parents' memory and Miguel's spirit. Today begins the reckoning. Today, the invisible become visible. Today, we remember who we really are. The morning sun had fully penetrated the fog now, streaming through the penthouse windows with the clarity of absolute truth, and Elena Vasquez, keeper of words and guardian of justice, prepared to step out of the shadows and reclaim her voice. The collision began, as most catastrophic moments do, with something deceptively ordinary. Marcus Blackwood descended the floating staircase of his penthouse at precisely 7:30 a.m., his Italian leather slippers making no sound against the polished concrete steps. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world, never doubted that everything around him existed for his convenience and pleasure. Elena was kneeling beside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, carefully cleaning the glass with practiced precision. The morning light streamed through her work, creating prismatic patterns that danced across the white marble floors. She had learned to time her cleaning to coincide with Marcus's morning routine, present when needed, invisible when not, a perfect balance of utility and discretion that had kept her employed for 18 months. But this morning was different. This morning, Marcus was not alone. 3 men in expensive suits sat around the dining table that Elena had polished to mirror perfection just an hour earlier. Their voices carried the unmistakable cadence of wealth and power, the careful diction of people who expected to be obeyed without question. Elena recognized the type from her UN days, power brokers who spoke in euphemisms and measured their words like precious metals. The first man, tall and silver-haired with the bearing of old European aristocracy, spoke with a crisp German accent that made Elena's linguistic instincts sharpen with attention. The second, younger and more nervous, carried the rapid-fire energy of New York finance in every gesture. The third remained largely silent, but when he did speak, it was in the flat, emotionless tones that Elena had learned to associate with serious money and serious danger. "The Beijing connection is growing impatient," the German was saying, as Marcus poured himself espresso from the machine that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "They've moved significant resources based on our assurances, and they expect results." Marcus waved dismissively, his casual arrogance on full display. "Let me worry about Beijing. The translation contract's a perfect cover. Who's going to question humanitarian aid organizations hiring linguistic services? It's the ideal money-washing system." Elena's cloth stilled against the glass. Her mind automatically catalogued the conversation, storing it with the precision that had made her one of the UN's most valued interpreters. Money washing, translation contracts as cover, Beijing connections. Each phrase painted a picture that was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly damning. The nervous New Yorker pulled out a tablet, its screen reflecting against Elena's freshly cleaned window. "The problem is volume, Marcus. We're talking about moving 50 million through the translation service contracts. That's going to require sophisticated documentation, multiple language versions, coordination across 6 countries. One mistake in the paperwork and nothing," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the irritating certainty of someone who had never faced real consequences. "I have the best translation technology in the world. Babel Bridge can handle any linguistic complexity you throw at it. We don't need human translators anymore. Those dinosaurs are expensive, unreliable, and ask too many questions." Elena continued cleaning, her movements automatic while her mind raced. She had heard Marcus disparage human translators before, but never in such a specific context. Never while discussing what sounded like an elaborate money laundering operation disguised as international translation services. The silent man finally spoke, his voice cutting through Marcus's bluster like a blade through silk. "Technology is impressive, Mr. Blackwood, but money laundering requires more than impressive technology. It requires understanding, cultural nuance, the kind of precision that can mean the difference between success and federal prison." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. Federal prison. These men were discussing crimes that could destroy lives, ruin families, fund activities that existed in the shadows of international law. And they were doing it in front of her as if she were a piece of furniture. A cleaning appliance with no ears, no mind, no capacity for understanding the implications of their words. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "You worry too much, Davies. The beauty of my system is its simplicity. We create translation contracts between shell companies I control. The Chinese pay for linguistic services that supposedly help their humanitarian organizations communicate with African aid recipients. The money moves through my accounts, gets translated into clean American dollars, and everyone wins." The German leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that Elena could barely hear. except for the actual aid recipients who never see the money that was supposedly being translated for their benefit. Collateral damage, Marcus shrugged, reaching for a pastry that his personal chef had prepared before dawn. Besides, most of those people don't speak enough English to know what they're missing anyway. Elena's hand tightened involuntarily around her cleaning cloth. The casual racism of Marcus's comment hit her like a physical blow, but it was the larger implication that made her blood run cold. These men were stealing money intended for humanitarian aid. They were exploiting the very linguistic barriers that Elena had spent her career trying to bridge, turning translation, the sacred art of human connection, into a tool for theft and deception. The New Yorker was scrolling through documents on his tablet, his voice rising with excitement. The beauty is in the documentation. We can create translation invoices for any language combination. Mandarin to Swahili, Arabic to Portuguese, Russian to French. The government auditors don't have linguists on staff. They see professional-looking invoices for translation services. They see money moving between legitimate-looking companies, and they never question whether the translations actually happened. Elena's mind began working with the precision of her old profession, automatically processing the linguistic implications of what she was hearing. Mandarin to Swahili, two languages with completely different grammatical structures and cultural contexts. Arabic to Portuguese, bridging not just languages, but entirely different writing systems. These were complex translation challenges that would require deep cultural knowledge and linguistic expertise. But according to Marcus, they were being handled by an app that treated all languages as interchangeable datasets. "What about quality control?" the silent man asked. "If someone actually examines these translation documents..." Marcus stood and walked to one of his wall-mounted displays, where a Babel bridge demonstration was running its eternal loop of linguistic conversion. "That's the genius of modern technology, gentlemen. My app doesn't just translate, it creates perfect documents in any target language. Native speakers couldn't tell the difference between my artificial translations and the real thing." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of Marcus's claim. No algorithm, no matter how sophisticated, could capture the cultural nuances that made translation an art rather than a science. She had seen government officials start wars over mistranslated diplomatic messages. She had watched international business deals collapse because someone confused formal and informal pronouns in Japanese. The idea that a smartphone app could handle the linguistic complexity of international money laundering was both arrogant and dangerously naive. The German was examining a stack of sample documents, his expression skeptical. These contracts mention translation services for humanitarian organizations in Somalia, Chad, Bangladesh. Are you telling me your technology can handle the dialectical variations of Somali? The regional differences in Bengali? It can handle whatever I tell it to handle, Marcus snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. The point isn't linguistic perfection, Davies. The point is plausible deniability. When the feds come looking for irregularities in international money transfers, they'll find professional translation contracts between legitimate companies providing essential services to humanitarian organizations. End of investigation. Elena's professional pride burned at Marcus's casual dismissal of linguistic complexity. But it was his next statement that made her heart race with a mixture of fury and opportunity. Besides, Marcus continued, his voice dripping with contempt, even if someone wanted to verify the translations, where would they find a translator qualified to check our work? Real polyglots are rare, expensive, and mostly work for institutions that couldn't afford to challenge us anyway. The days of human translators are over. The future belongs to efficient, scalable, profitable technology. The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of electronics and the distant sound of San Francisco traffic far below. Elena continued cleaning the windows, her movements steady and mechanical, But inside, she felt the familiar stirring of professional competence awakening after months of dormancy. These men were committing crimes that exploited her life's work. They were stealing money from people who desperately needed help, using translation as cover for their theft, and they were doing it all based on the arrogant assumption that no one possessed the linguistic skills necessary to expose their deception. They were wrong. The New Yorker was packing up his tablet, clearly pleased with the morning's progress. "When do we start the first transfers?" "Next week," Marcus replied. "I've already established the shell companies, created the humanitarian front organizations, and prepared the initial translation contracts. Beijing has confirmed their first payment of 10 million, supposedly for Mandarin to Swahili translation services for refugee assistance programs in Kenya." Elena's mind automatically began parsing the linguistic challenges of such a translation. Mandarin, with its tonal complexities and cultural specificity. Swahili, with its Bantu grammatical structure and Arabic loanwords. The cultural contexts were so different that even simple concepts would require extensive explanation and cultural bridging. A refugee assistance program would need to address everything from medical terminology to legal concepts to emotional support, areas where mistranslation could literally mean the difference between life and death. But Marcus was treating it like a simple data conversion, as if human language was just another digital file to be processed and reformatted. The German stood, smoothing his suit with the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to expensive tailoring. "I trust you understand the stakes here, Mr. Blackwood. Our Chinese associates are not known for their patience with partners who fail to deliver." Marcus's confidence never wavered. "They'll get their money, clean and untraceable. And I'll get my percentage for providing the perfect washing machine. Everyone wins. Except for the refugees who'll never receive the aid that money was supposed to fund," the silent man said quietly. "Not my problem," Marcus shrugged. "I'm a technology entrepreneur, not a humanitarian. I solve problems efficiently and profitably. Moral complexity is for people who can't afford to think clearly." Elena felt something inside her chest tighten and then release, like a spring that had been compressed for months, finally snapping back to its natural shape. This was it. This was the moment Miguel had been preparing her for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. This was when the invisible woman in the corner would step forward and remind the world that true translation required more than technology. It required humanity, expertise, and above all, integrity. The three visitors gathered their belongings, shaking Marcus's hand with the cold efficiency of people completing a business transaction. As they waited for the elevator, the German made one final observation that would prove prophetic. "Just remember, Marcus, in our business the people you don't notice are often the ones who can destroy you. Arrogance has ended more promising careers than incompetence ever has." Marcus laughed dismissively. "I notice everything that matters, and what matters is results, not the opinions of people who don't understand how modern business works." The elevator doors closed on his associates, leaving Marcus alone in his penthouse with Elena, who was putting away her cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision she brought to all her tasks. He barely glanced in her direction as he prepared for his day, his mind already moving on to the next meeting, the next deal, the next opportunity to prove his superiority over the slower, more cumbersome world of human limitation. As Elena gathered her supplies, she made a mental note to herself in Spanish. "Hoy comienza la justicia." Today, justice begins. But she continued her work in silence, invisible as always, storing every word of the morning's conversation with the precision of a professional who had once helped prevent international conflicts through the careful management of language and meaning. Marcus Blackwood had no idea that the woman cleaning his windows spoke all the languages he was planning to exploit. He had no idea that she understood the complex cultural implications of every translation he was planning to fake. And he certainly had no idea that his casual dismissal of human translators had just awakened a dormant professional pride in someone who had the knowledge, skills, and motivation to destroy everything he had built. The morning sun climbed higher over San Francisco, burning away the last wisps of fog and illuminating the penthouse in harsh, revealing light. Elena finished her work and retreated to the basement, but her mind remained in that dining room, cataloguing evidence and planning justice with the methodical precision that had once made her one of the most respected interpreters in international diplomacy. The collision had occurred. Now came the reckoning. If this story has captured your attention, if Marcus's arrogance has made you feel that familiar burn of injustice, I invite you to share your thoughts. What moment in these early chapters made you most angry? What details stood out as the most telling sign of the storm that's brewing? Your engagement helps stories like Elena's reach the people who need to hear them most. The silence that followed Marcus Blackwood's dismissive laughter seemed to stretch across the penthouse like a held breath, pregnant with the weight of words unspoken and truths about to emerge. Elena had retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to organize her cleaning supplies, but in reality to process the magnitude of what she had just witnessed. Her hands moved automatically, arranging bottles and cloths with the muscle memory of 18 months of servitude, while her mind catalogued every detail of the conversation with the precision that had once made her indispensable to world leaders. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the marble floors like fingers pointing toward an inevitable reckoning. Marcus stood at his massive desk, surrounded by the technological monuments to his success, multiple screens displaying Babel Bridge analytics, awards commemorating his revolutionary contribution to global communication, and framed magazine covers that celebrated his vision of a world without language barriers. But Elena saw something else in those displays now. She saw Miguel's stolen algorithms masquerading as Marcus's innovation. She saw her late husband's humanitarian dream perverted into a tool for international crime. She saw the sacred art of translation, the bridge between cultures that had given her life meaning, being reduced to digital window dressing for money laundering operations. The phone on Marcus's desk rang with the distinctive tone he had programmed for high-priority international calls. Elena recognized the pattern from months of cleaning around his morning routine. Beijing was calling early, which meant something significant was happening in the carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise she had just learned about. Marcus answered with his typical confidence, switching on the speaker function with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself surrounded only by technology and invisible servants. The voice that emerged spoke in rapid Mandarin, the tones rising and falling with the musical precision that made Chinese one of Elena's favorite languages to interpret. "The first transfer is ready," the voice said in Mandarin, each word carrying the weight of criminal conspiracy. $10 million American laundered through translation service contracts for humanitarian aid to East African refugees. Our documentation shows payment for Mandarin to Swahili translation services for medical and legal aid programs in Kenya. Elena's breath caught. The voice was speaking with the educated accent of Beijing's financial district, using formal language that indicated high-level government or corporate connections. This wasn't street-level crime. This was sophisticated international money laundering involving state-level resources. Marcus responded in English, apparently confident that his Babel Bridge technology could handle any translation needs in real time. "Excellent. My team has prepared the receiving documentation. The shell companies are established, the humanitarian front organizations are operational, and the translation contracts are ready for processing. And the linguistic verification," the Beijing voice continued in Mandarin. Our associates require assurance that the translation documents will withstand governmental audit. The Swahili documentation must be culturally appropriate for Kenyan administrative review. Elena almost smiled at the irony. The criminals were more concerned about linguistic authenticity than Marcus was. They understood what he refused to acknowledge. That translation was about more than converting words from one language to another. Real translation required cultural knowledge, regional specificity, administrative familiarity, the kind of expertise that took years to develop and couldn't be replicated by any algorithm. Marcus waved dismissively at the speaker, even though his caller couldn't see the gesture. Technology has solved that problem. Babelbridge doesn't just translate, it creates culturally appropriate documentation that's indistinguishable from native speaker work. I guarantee that any audit will find perfect linguistic compliance. The Beijing voice paused, and Elena could hear the skepticism even across language barriers. Mr. Blackwood, forgive my directness, but this operation involves significant resources and considerable risk. Are you certain your technological solution can handle the complexity of East African administrative Swahili, the regional dialects, the legal terminology specific to refugee assistance programs? Elena's professional pride flared at the question. East African administrative Swahili was indeed complex, incorporating Arabic legal terminology, English colonial administrative language, and indigenous grammatical structures that had evolved over centuries of cultural interaction. It was exactly the kind of linguistic challenge that required deep cultural knowledge and years of practical experience. But Marcus's confidence never wavered. I understand your concerns, but you're thinking like someone from the old paradigm. Human translators are inefficient, expensive, and unnecessary. My technology doesn't these problems that human limitations can't solve. As Marcus spoke, Elena moved closer to the phone, ostensibly to dust the nearby surfaces, but actually to ensure she could hear every nuance of the conversation. The Beijing voice switched to a more direct tone, the kind Elena recognized from high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. Then perhaps you could demonstrate this capability, the voice said in Mandarin. We have prepared a test document, administrative language for refugee medical assistance programs. If your technology can translate this into culturally appropriate Kenyan administrative Swahili, we will proceed with full confidence. Elena watched as Marcus's tablet chimed with an incoming document. He glanced at the screen with casual confidence, then activated Babelbridge's translation function. The app hummed through its processing routine, analyzing the Chinese text and generating what it claimed was perfect Swahili translation. Marcus began reading the translated text with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his technology's capabilities. But as Elena listened, her professional horror grew with each mispronounced word, each grammatically incorrect phrase, each culturally inappropriate reference. The translation was a disaster. Babelbridge had converted Chinese medical terminology into generic Swahili words that would be meaningless in a Kenyan administrative context. Legal references had been translated literally, losing all cultural meaning. Formal address protocols had been ignored entirely, creating a document that would immediately identify itself as machine-generated to any native speaker. But Marcus continued reading with unwavering confidence, completely unaware that he was demonstrating the exact limitations that would destroy his criminal enterprise. The Beijing voice interrupted, speaking in Mandarin with barely controlled alarm. Mr. Blackwood, I must stop you there. That translation is problematic. The medical terminology is incorrect for East African usage. The legal references would be meaningless to Kenyan administrators. The formal structure ignores essential cultural protocols. Elena saw Marcus's confidence flicker for the first time. He stared at his tablet as if the technology had betrayed him, his mind apparently struggling to process feedback that contradicted his fundamental beliefs about his app's capabilities. That's impossible, Marcus stammered. Babel Bridge has the most sophisticated translation algorithms in the world. It's been tested across dozens of language pairs. The accuracy ratings are irrelevant. The Beijing voice cut him off, switching to English with crisp, unforgiving precision. Mr. Blackwood, this operation requires linguistic precision that your technology cannot provide. We need human translators, real experts, native speakers with cultural knowledge and administrative experience. Elena felt the moment crystallizing around her like a photograph developing in solution. This was it. This was when the invisible woman in the corner would step forward and demonstrate that true linguistic expertise couldn't be replicated by any algorithm, no matter how sophisticated. She cleared her throat softly. Marcus glanced in her direction with irritation, apparently annoyed that his domestic help would interrupt an important business call. "Not now," he said curtly in English. "Can't you see I'm handling a crisis?" Elena responded in perfect Mandarin, her voice carrying the trained precision of simultaneous interpretation. "Perhaps I could be of assistance, Mr. Blackwood. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding about translation capabilities." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at Elena as if she had spontaneously transformed into a completely different person. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His brain apparently unable to process the fact that his Spanish-speaking maid had just addressed him in fluent Mandarin. The Beijing voice responded immediately, also in Mandarin, with the surprised delight of someone encountering unexpected competence. "Ah, finally, someone who understands the complexity of our requirements. Are you a professional translator, Miss?" "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she replied in Mandarin, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to facilitating communication between world leaders. Former UN simultaneous interpreter, specialized in diplomatic and technical translation across 10 languages, including Mandarin and Swahili. Marcus's tablet clattered to the floor. Elena switched to English, addressing Marcus directly while maintaining her connection to the Beijing caller. "The translation you just provided would be immediately identified as machine-generated by any Kenyan administrative official. The medical terminology is generic rather than region-specific. The legal references use Tanzanian rather than Kenyan administrative language. The formal protocols ignore the Arabic honorific traditions that are essential to East African professional communication." The Beijing voice responded in rapid Mandarin. "Dr. Vasquez, would you be willing to provide the correct translation? We are, as you might imagine, extremely interested in working with someone who possesses genuine expertise." Elena paused, looking directly at Marcus, with an expression that conveyed 18 months of accumulated knowledge, professional pride reawakening, and carefully calculated justice about to be served. "I speak 10 languages fluently," she said in English, her voice carrying quiet authority. "I have facilitated peace negotiations between hostile nations. I have translated life and death medical information for refugee assistance programs in 7 countries. I spent 15 years ensuring that critical communication was never lost in translation." Marcus's face had gone completely pale. He was staring at Elena as if seeing her for the first time, his mind apparently racing through months of conversations he had conducted in her presence, strategies he had discussed, crimes he had planned while assuming he was surrounded only by technology and ignorant help. Elena continued in Mandarin for the Beijing caller, her voice warm with professional competence. "I would be happy to provide accurate translation services. However, I should mention that the documents you're discussing appear to be fraudulent. The humanitarian organizations referenced don't exist, and the refugee assistance programs you've mentioned are not operational in the regions specified." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear Marcus's labored breathing, the distant hum of traffic far below, and the almost inaudible electronic whisper of devices throughout the penthouse. Finally, the Beijing voice spoke in English, addressing Marcus directly with ice-cold precision. Mr. Blackwood, it appears your operation has been compromised by your own arrogance. Dr. Vasquez, we will be in touch regarding alternative arrangements. The line went dead. Marcus stood frozen in his minimalist living room, surrounded by the technological monuments to his success, staring at the woman who had been cleaning his floors for 18 months and who had just destroyed his criminal enterprise with a few sentences in languages he didn't understand. Elena looked at him calmly, her hands steady as she finished organizing her cleaning supplies. "Surprise, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "The future still needs human translators." The elevator descended into Marcus Blackwood's penthouse with mechanical precision, its polished steel doors opening to reveal a figure Elena recognized from another lifetime. James Park stepped into the living room with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to extracting truth from unwilling sources, his dark eyes immediately cataloguing the scene before him. The shattered tablet on the marble floor, Marcus frozen in disbelief, and Elena standing with the calm dignity of someone who had finally reclaimed her voice. "Elena." James's voice carried the warmth of shared history and professional respect. He spoke in English, but Elena could hear the subtle Korean inflections that reminded her of their late-night strategy sessions at the UN, when they had worked together to unravel complex international communications that often hid darker truths beneath diplomatic language. "James," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper. What is happening? Who is this man? How did he get past building security?" Elena moved to stand beside her former colleague, her posture straightening with each step as she shed 18 months of enforced invisibility. "Mr. Blackwood, may I introduce James Park, investigative journalist for the Financial Times and former UN communications analyst. James has been tracking suspicious money flows through technology companies for the past 6 months. James pulled out a small digital recorder with the casual efficiency of someone who had conducted thousands of interviews. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been investigating Babelbridge Industries for suspected intellectual property theft and potential money laundering operations. Dr. Vasquez contacted me this morning with some very interesting information about your business activities." Marcus's face cycled through confusion, anger, and growing panic. "Dr. Vasquez, she's my housekeeper. She cleans toilets and makes beds. She doesn't know anything about my business." "Actually," Elena said quietly, "I know quite a bit about your business. When you work in someone's home for 18 months, when you're invisible to them, you tend to overhear conversations, especially when those conversations involve the languages you happen to speak fluently." James activated his recorder and pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying what appeared to be a complex financial analysis. "Mr. Blackwood, our preliminary investigation suggests that Babelbridge Industries has processed approximately $37 million through fraudulent translation service contracts over the past 14 months. Would you care to comment?" Marcus backed away from them, his confidence evaporating like morning fog. "This is ridiculous. This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyers." "Your lawyers may be busy," James replied calmly. "We've also been investigating the ownership of Babelbridge's core technology. Dr. Vasquez provided us with some fascinating documentation about the algorithms that form the foundation of your translation software." Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew a small USB drive, its silver surface catching the penthouse lighting. "Miguel's hidden files," she said simply. "Complete development logs, email correspondence, patent applications, and recorded conversations that document the true origin of Babelbridge's translation algorithms." Marcus stared at the drive as if it were a weapon pointed at his heart. Those files are proprietary corporate information. Any documents related to our early development phase are protected by confidentiality agreements and And fraud invalidates confidentiality agreements, James interrupted, his voice carrying the precision of someone who had spent years navigating international law. Dr. Vasquez's late husband, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, developed the core translation algorithms that power Bubblebridge. The documentation she provided shows a clear pattern of intellectual property theft, breach of partnership agreements, and deliberate erasure of Dr. Vasquez's contributions. Elena walked to the massive windows that she had cleaned just hours earlier, looking out over the city where her life had been systematically destroyed by the man now cowering behind his expensive furniture. "Miguel trusted you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of betrayal that had accumulated over 2 years of poverty and humiliation. "He believed you shared his vision of technology that would serve humanity rather than exploit it." "He was dying," Marcus said desperately, his voice rising with panic. The company needed leadership, needed someone who could make the hard decisions that Miguel was too sick to make. "I saved the technology from disappearing into academic obscurity." James looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who had heard every variation of corporate justification. "Mr. Blackwood, according to the email correspondence Dr. Vasquez provided, you began filing patent applications under your own name while Dr. Vasquez was still undergoing chemotherapy. You restructured the company's ownership while he was too sick to review legal documents, and you systematically removed his name from all technical documentation." Elena turned from the windows, her face calm but her eyes burning with carefully controlled fury. "You didn't just steal his work, Marcus. You stole his legacy. His dream was to create technology that would help people understand each other better. You perverted that dream into a tool for money laundering and criminal enterprise." Marcus slumped into one of his minimalist chairs, the expensive leather creaking under the weight of his collapsing world. "The translation software works. It's revolutionary. It's helped millions of people communicate across language barriers." "The translation software is mediocre at best," Elena replied with professional precision. "It handles simple conversational exchanges adequately, but it completely fails at complex technical, legal, or cultural translation, as you just demonstrated with your Chinese associates." James scrolled through his tablet, displaying what appeared to be a complex network analysis. "Mr. Blackwood, we've traced the money flow through your fraudulent translation contracts. Shell companies in 7 countries, fake humanitarian organizations, fabricated translation projects. The Beijing connection alone involves $50 million in laundered funds." Marcus's face had gone ashen. "You don't understand the complexity of international business. Sometimes money needs to move through unconventional channels to reach people who need help." Elena laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Miguel used to say the same thing, that money should move to help people who need it, but he meant refugee assistance programs, medical aid organizations, educational initiatives for underserved communities, not international criminal enterprises." James held up his tablet, showing what appeared to be recorded financial transactions. "Dr. Vasquez recorded this morning's conference call with your Beijing associates. The entire conversation in Mandarin, English, and German, documenting a detailed money laundering operation, disguised as translation services." Marcus's mouth opened and closed silently. Elena could see the moment when he realized the full scope of his exposure. Not just intellectual property theft, not just corporate fraud, but recorded evidence of international money laundering operations discussed in his own home, while he believed himself surrounded only by technology and ignorant help. "The recording," Elena said softly, "includes your explicit statements about money washing, your dismissal of humanitarian concerns, and your detailed descriptions of the criminal enterprise. All in your own voice, in your own words, with your complete understanding of the illegal nature of the operations." James saved his files and looked directly at Marcus with the calm intensity of someone delivering a professional death sentence. "Mr. Blackwood, We've shared this information with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the SEC, and Interpol's International Money Laundering Task Force. Your assets have been frozen pending investigation. Your company's operations have been suspended. And several international law enforcement agencies are very interested in speaking with you. Marcus stood shakily, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. This is insane. This is a setup. You can't prove that I knew, that I intended, that the money was... Actually, Elena said, walking to Marcus's desk and pulling out a thick folder she had retrieved from her cleaning supplies. We can prove all of that. Miguel wasn't just a brilliant programmer. He was also paranoid about protecting his intellectual property. He recorded everything. She spread documents across Marcus's polished desk. Technical specifications, email printouts, financial records, and legal correspondence that told the complete story of Babel Bridge's creation and Marcus's systematic theft of Miguel's life work. Development logs showing Miguel's creation of the core translation algorithms, Elena said, her voice taking on the clinical precision she had once used in UN presentations. Email correspondence documenting your promises to protect Miguel's interests and share profits equitably. Legal documents showing how you restructured the company while Miguel was too sick to review the changes. Financial records proving that you began profiting from Miguel's work before he was even dead. James examined the documents with professional thoroughness. Dr. Vasquez, this documentation is extraordinary. It provides a complete timeline of intellectual property theft, fraudulent business practices, and deliberate exploitation of a dying partner's vulnerability. Marcus sat heavily in his chair, staring at the evidence of his crimes spread across his desk like tarot cards predicting an inevitable future. Miguel was going to die anyway. The technology was going to be wasted. I created something meaningful from his work. Elena's voice, when she responded, was quiet, but it carried the weight of 2 years' accumulated grief and rage. Miguel's dream was to create technology that would preserve endangered languages, help immigrants navigate complex systems in their adopted countries, facilitate genuine cultural exchange. You turned his humanitarian vision into a criminal enterprise that steals money from the very people Miguel wanted to help. Adieu. The silence that followed was broken by the distinctive sound of elevator doors opening. Elena and James exchanged glances. They had not called for additional visitors. But as the elevator revealed its passengers, Elena felt a surge of satisfaction that everything was unfolding according to the careful plan she and James had developed over weeks of secret coordination. 3 figures emerged. A stern woman in a black suit carrying federal credentials, a younger man with the technical bearing of a computer forensics specialist, and an older gentleman whose expensive clothing and measured movements suggested high-level legal authority. Mr. Blackwood, the woman said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of federal law enforcement. I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs seemed unable to support him. This can't be happening. I have rights. I have lawyers. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Chen continued with practiced precision, which I strongly recommend you exercise immediately. Elena watched as federal agents placed handcuffs on the man who had stolen her husband's legacy and destroyed her family's future. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the quiet dignity of justice finally served and truth finally revealed. As Marcus was led toward the elevator, he turned back toward Elena with desperate eyes. You don't understand what you've done. The technology industry is built on this kind of creative acquisition. Everyone does it. I'm not a criminal. I'm an entrepreneur. Elena looked at him with the calm gaze of someone who had spent 18 months studying her target's weaknesses and planning this precise moment of reckoning. Miguel used to say that the difference between an entrepreneur and a thief is what you build versus what you steal. You built an empire on stolen genius and called it innovation. James was packing his equipment with professional efficiency. Dr. Vasquez, the Financial Times will be running a comprehensive expose on the Babel Bridge fraud tomorrow morning. Miguel's contributions will be fully acknowledged, and the humanitarian organizations that were supposed to receive the laundered money will be contacted about legitimate aid opportunities. Elena nodded, feeling lighter than she had in 2 years. Miguel always said that words have power, the power to build bridges or destroy them, to reveal truth or hide it. Today, finally, the words spoke for justice. As the elevator doors closed on Marcus Blackwood's criminal empire, Elena stood in the penthouse that had been her prison for 18 months, surrounded by the technological monuments to stolen genius, and began planning her return to the world where language served humanity rather than exploiting it. The sun was setting over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of justice, served and truth revealed. And Dr. Elena Vasquez, keeper of words and guardian of her husband's legacy, prepared to step back into the light where she belonged. The federal building in downtown San Francisco hummed with the quiet efficiency of justice in motion. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Blackwood's arrest, and the ripple effects of his criminal empire's collapse were still reverberating through international financial networks. Elena sat in a conference room on the 14th floor, surrounded by FBI agents, international law enforcement officials, and representatives from humanitarian organizations that had been unwitting victims of Marcus's elaborate fraud. Agent Chen spread photographs across the polished conference table, images of refugee camps in Kenya, medical clinics in Chad, educational programs in Bangladesh. Dr. Vasquez, because of your testimony and the evidence you provided, we've been able to track down the actual destinations where the laundered money was supposed to go. $53 million that was diverted from legitimate humanitarian aid programs. Elena studied the photographs with professional interest, but also with the deep personal satisfaction of knowing that Miguel's dream was finally being realized in the way he had always intended. These were the people his technology was meant to serve, not international criminals, but vulnerable populations who needed genuine assistance with communication and cultural barriers. James Park looked up from his laptop, where he was typing notes for his follow-up article. The most remarkable aspect of this case is how technology that was designed to build bridges between cultures was perverted into a tool for exploitation. But now, with the recovery of these funds and the restoration of Dr. Miguel Vasquez's intellectual property rights, the technology can return to its original humanitarian purpose. Agent Chen nodded toward a stack of legal documents. Mr. Blackwood's assets have been completely liquidated. The penthouse, the corporate headquarters, the shell companies, everything. After legal fees and restitution payments, there's still approximately $38 million available for humanitarian distribution and technology development grants. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions as she processed the magnitude of what had been recovered. It was more money than she and Miguel had ever dreamed of having, more resources than they had ever imagined their technology could generate. But it came at the cost of 2 years of poverty, humiliation, and the loss of Miguel's chance to see his vision fulfilled. What happens to the technology itself? Elena asked, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned to negotiate complex international agreements. A new voice answered from the doorway, Dr. Patricia Morrison, director of the United Nations Development Program, who had flown from New York specifically for this meeting. Dr. Vasquez, the UN is prepared to offer you a comprehensive package for the redevelopment of your late husband's translation technology. Research funding, institutional support, and most importantly, a guarantee that the technology will be used exclusively for humanitarian purposes. Elena stood as Dr. Morrison entered the room. recognizing the older woman from her years of UN service. Patricia Morrison had been a senior administrator during Elena's time as a simultaneous interpreter, someone who had understood and appreciated the complexity of linguistic diplomacy. "Patricia," Elena said, switching automatically to the slightly formal but warm tone that characterized UN professional relationships. "I didn't expect to see you here." Dr. Morrison smiled with genuine warmth. "Elena, when James contacted our office about this case, I knew immediately that we needed to be involved. Miguel's original vision, technology that enhances human translation rather than replacing it, is exactly what our field programs have been needing for years." James pulled up a document on his laptop screen. "Dr. Morrison, could you explain the specific applications you're envisioning for the humanitarian technology development?" Dr. Morrison moved to the conference room's presentation screen, connecting her own device with practiced efficiency. "The needs are enormous and constantly evolving. Refugee assistance programs that require medical translation in real time. Educational initiatives that need to preserve local languages while teaching international curricula. Legal aid programs that must navigate complex cultural and linguistic barriers." The screen filled with images of UN field operations, translators working with medical teams in Somalia, educational coordinators developing curricula in multiple languages for displaced populations, legal aid workers helping refugees navigate asylum processes in languages they barely understood. "The key difference," Dr. Morrison continued, "is that Miguel's approach always emphasized human expertise enhanced by technology, rather than technology replacing human insight. That's what makes his algorithms revolutionary, not because they eliminate the need for human translators, but because they make human translators more effective." Elena studied the images on the screen, recognizing the complex challenges that each situation represented. These were exactly the kinds of problems that had motivated Miguel's original research. Situations where cultural misunderstanding could have life or death consequences, where nuanced communication was essential but resources were limited. Agent Chen consulted her files. "Dr. Vasquez, there's also the matter of Mr. Blackwood's personal accountability. He's facing federal charges that could result in 25 to 30 years in prison. The prosecution would like your input on sentencing recommendations." Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of that responsibility. Marcus Blackwood had stolen her husband's legacy, destroyed her family's financial security, and exploited humanitarian causes for criminal profit. The legal system was prepared to deliver justice commensurate with his crimes. But as she considered her response, Elena found herself thinking about Miguel's approach to problems, methodical, compassionate, focused on solutions rather than punishment. "I want him to understand," she said finally, "what his actions actually cost. Not just financially, but humanly. I want him to see the refugee camps where his fraudulent contracts diverted medical aid. I want him to meet the translators whose livelihoods he claimed were obsolete. I want him to comprehend the difference between innovation and theft." Dr. Morrison leaned forward with interest. "Are you suggesting some form of restorative justice process?" Elena nodded slowly. Miguel always believed that education was more powerful than punishment. Marcus Blackwood committed his crimes because he fundamentally misunderstood what translation actually involves. He saw language as data to be processed rather than culture to be understood. James looked up from his note-taking with reporter's curiosity. "What kind of educational process are you envisioning?" Elena moved to the window, looking out over San Francisco's financial district, where Marcus had once held court in his glass tower, believing himself master of forces he had never bothered to understand. "Community service," she said. "Real community service. Working with actual translators in actual humanitarian situations. Learning what it means when communication fails because technology can't capture cultural context. Understanding the human cost of reducing language to algorithmic simplification." Agent Chen examined this suggestion with professional skepticism. Dr. Vasquez, given the severity of Mr. Blackwood's crimes, the federal guidelines call for significant prison time. Community service would be a minimal component of any sentence. I'm not suggesting community service instead of prison, Elena clarified. I'm suggesting community service as part of his rehabilitation process. Let him serve his sentence, but let part of that service involve actually learning what he claimed to be disrupting. Dr. Morrison nodded with understanding. There's precedent for that kind of educational component in white-collar sentencing. And frankly, the UN could use the additional volunteer labor in our field programs, assuming proper supervision and security protocols. Elena returned to her seat at the conference table, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just Marcus Blackwood's future, but the future of the technology Miguel had dreamed of creating. There's something else, she said, pulling out a folder she had been carrying since entering the building. Miguel left detailed notes about his vision for the technology's development, not just the technical specifications, but the ethical framework he wanted to guide its implementation. She spread Miguel's handwritten notes across the table, pages covered with diagrams, code snippets, and philosophical observations about the relationship between technology and human dignity. He called it digital dignity, Elena explained, her voice softening as she shared Miguel's words. The idea that translation technology should amplify human expertise rather than replacing it, should preserve cultural nuance rather than homogenizing it, should serve the most vulnerable populations rather than the most profitable markets. James was photographing the documents with professional interest. This could form the foundation for an entirely new approach to humanitarian technology development. Dr. Morrison studied Miguel's notes with the attention of someone who understood both their technical sophistication and their humanitarian implications. Elena, the UN would be honored to sponsor the Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Initiative. We could establish it as a permanent program for developing translation technology specifically for humanitarian applications. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes for the first time since Miguel's death. Not tears of grief or anger, but tears of profound gratitude that his vision was finally being understood and implemented by people who shared his values. He always said that the true test of any technology was whether it served the people who needed it most, she said. Not the people who could afford it most, but the people who needed it most. Agent Chen was taking detailed notes of the conversation. Dr. Vasquez, if we were to incorporate educational and restorative justice components into Mr. Blackwood's sentencing, would you be willing to supervise or coordinate those activities? Elena considered the question carefully. Supervising Marcus Blackwood's rehabilitation would mean working closely with the man who had destroyed her family's life. It would mean setting aside personal revenge in favor of educational justice. It would mean embodying Miguel's belief that understanding was more powerful than punishment. Yes, she said finally, but on specific conditions. Marcus must demonstrate genuine understanding of the communities his crimes affected. He must complete meaningful service projects with real humanitarian organizations. And he must publicly acknowledge Miguel's contributions to the technology he stole. Dr. Morrison smiled with approval. Those conditions align perfectly with the UN's approach to restorative justice. We found that offenders who genuinely understand the impact of their crimes are far less likely to repeat them. James saved his files and looked around the table with satisfaction. This is going to make an extraordinary follow-up story. The widow who brought down a criminal empire through linguistic expertise and then chose education over revenge. Elena shook her head gently. It's not about me, James. It's about the work. It's about ensuring that Miguel's vision serves the people it was always meant to serve. As the meeting concluded and participants began gathering their materials, Elena found herself thinking about Sophia, who was now a freshman at Stanford, studying international relations and linguistics. Her daughter had grown up hearing stories about the power of language to build bridges between cultures, and she was preparing for a career that would continue that work into the next generation. The circle was closing, but not ending. Miguel's technology would finally serve its intended purpose. The humanitarian organizations that had been defrauded would receive the assistance they needed. And Marcus Blackwood would learn, whether he wanted to or not, what translation actually meant when human dignity hung in the balance. Elena gathered Miguel's notes, carefully placing them back in their folder. Tomorrow, she would begin the complex work of rebuilding not just the technology, but the ethical framework that would guide its use. She would return to the world of professional translation, but this time with resources and authority to ensure that language truly served as a bridge between cultures rather than a barrier. The sun was setting over San Francisco, painting the federal building in shades of justice served and hope renewed. And Dr. Elena Vasquez, keeper of words and guardian of digital dignity, prepared to step into a future where her husband's dreams would finally be realized by the people who needed them most. 6 months after Marcus Blackwood's sentencing, the transformation rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, each circle of change expanding to touch lives that had never heard of Babel Bridge or translation algorithms, but who felt the impact of justice restored and technology redirected toward its intended purpose. In the basement server room of the newly established Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Institute, housed in a converted warehouse in San Francisco's Mission District, Elena watched as lines of code scrolled across multiple monitors. The space hummed with purposeful energy, young programmers working alongside experienced translators, their conversations mixing English, Spanish, Mandarin, and Arabic as naturally as breathing. The walls were covered not with awards or marketing materials, but with photographs from humanitarian missions where their technology was already making a difference. Sofia Vasquez Chen, she had added her father's name officially when she turned 18, stood at a whiteboard covered with linguistic diagrams explaining the cultural implications of tonal variations in Mandarin medical terminology to a team of programmers who were developing translation protocols for refugee health clinics. "The difference between Zhuzhen and Zhuzhen is one tone," Sophia said, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had grown up bilingual and understood language as living culture rather than data points. "But one means acupuncture treatment and the other means old needle." In a medical context, mistranslating that single tone could literally mean the difference between life and death. Elena felt a surge of pride watching her daughter navigate the complex intersection of technology and humanity that Miguel had always envisioned. At 19, Sophia possessed an intuitive understanding of linguistic nuance that complemented her inherited facility with computer programming. She was becoming exactly what Miguel had hoped, a bridge between technological capability and human wisdom. Across town, in a community center in Oakland's Fruitvale district, Carmen Martinez was using the Institute's new immigration assistance app to help recently arrived families navigate the labyrinthine process of asylum applications. Carmen, whose own family had benefited from Elena's pro bono translation services during the darkest period after Miguel's death, now coordinated the community outreach programs that made the Institute's technology accessible to the people who needed it most. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Carmen said gently in Spanish to an elderly woman whose hands shook as she held documents that would determine her family's future in America. "The computer can translate the legal language into words you understand, but I'm here to explain what it really means for your situation." The Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Institute had deliberately designed their technology to work in partnership with human translators rather than replacing them. The software could handle the mechanical aspects of translation, converting legal terminology, standardizing medical vocabulary, ensuring grammatical accuracy. But human interpreters provided the cultural context, emotional support, and nuanced understanding that no algorithm could replicate. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from her documents with tears of relief. My grandson, he speaks good English, but he cannot explain to me what these papers mean for our family. Now I understand. Thank you. Carmen smiled, remembering her own family's struggles with incomprehensible legal documents and bureaucratic language that seemed designed to exclude rather than include. My friend Elena, she created this technology because she believes everyone deserves to understand the words that affect their lives. In a federal minimum security facility in Northern California, Marcus Blackwood was completing his court-mandated community service assignment. Under the direct supervision of UN humanitarian coordinators, he was working in a refugee resettlement program where his tasks included the unglamorous but educational work of helping translators prepare orientation materials for newly arrived asylum seekers. Marcus sat at a folding table in a church basement that served as a community resource center, carefully proofreading a document that explained American healthcare systems to Somali refugees. The work required him to pay attention to details he had never considered during his corporate career. The cultural implications of medical privacy, the way bureaucratic language could intimidate people who were already vulnerable, the critical importance of precise translation when someone's understanding could affect their family's survival. Mr. Blackwood, said Dr. Amara Hassan, the Somali-American physician who supervised his volunteer work, this document mentions preventive care. How would you explain that concept to someone whose previous experience with medicine involved life-or-death emergency treatment in refugee camps? Marcus looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful in a way that would have been unrecognizable to his former corporate associates. 6 months of mandatory education about humanitarian translation had gradually opened his eyes to the complexity he had dismissed so casually from his penthouse. I would need to explain the American medical philosophy, he said slowly, that treating small problems early prevents larger problems later, but I would also need to understand their cultural background, their previous experiences with healthcare systems, their fears about authority figures in uniforms. Dr. Hassan nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. Now, how would your translation app have handled that cultural context? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, remembering his confident assertions about technological superiority and the obsolescence of human translators. It wouldn't have. It would have converted the words accurately, but completely missed the meaning. And what would have been the consequence of that missed meaning? Families might have avoided medical care they needed, Marcus said, the reality of human cost finally penetrating his understanding. Children might have gotten sicker. People might have suffered because they didn't understand that the system was trying to help them, not threaten them. Dr. Hassan smiled with the patience of someone who had spent years educating people about the intersection of culture and healthcare. Understanding that difference is what makes you useful here, Mr. Blackwood. Your technical knowledge, combined with growing cultural awareness, creates value. Your technology alone created danger. Marcus returned to his proofreading with newfound humility. The document he was reviewing had been created using the Institute's new translation protocols, technology that enhanced human expertise rather than replacing it, that flagged cultural complexity rather than ignoring it, that connected people to human translators when algorithmic precision wasn't sufficient. Meanwhile, at Stanford University's School of International Relations, Professor Elena Vasquez was concluding her afternoon seminar on technology and cultural diplomacy. The classroom was packed beyond capacity, students sitting in aisles, standing against walls, drawn by Elena's unique combination of academic expertise and real-world experience. The fundamental question, Elena said, advancing to her final slide, is not whether technology can replace human insight, but how technology can amplify human wisdom. The Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Framework asks us to design systems that serve humanity rather than displacing it. A student raised her hand. Professor Vasquez, how do we ensure that humanitarian technology actually reaches the communities that need it most? Elena smiled, recognizing the idealism that had once motivated her own career choices. By designing with those communities from the beginning, by hiring translators from refugee populations, by testing our systems in real humanitarian contexts rather than corporate conference rooms, by measuring success through human dignity rather than profit margins. Another student followed up. But isn't that approach less efficient, less scalable, less profitable? Excellent question, Elena replied. Define efficiency. If efficient means processing the maximum amount of data with the minimum human involvement, then yes, our approach is less efficient. But if efficient means actually solving the problems we claim to address, actually serving the people we claim to help, actually building bridges rather than barriers between cultures, then our approach is extraordinarily efficient. After class, Elena walked across the Stanford campus, where she and Miguel had once dreamed of changing the world through technology that served human dignity. The late afternoon sun filtered through the palm trees that lined the pathways, casting long shadows that reminded her of the penthouse windows she had once cleaned while planning the restoration of her husband's legacy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "Mom, the UN just approved our proposal for the Universal Translation Protocol. We're going to pilot test it in refugee camps in Jordan, Kenya, and Bangladesh. Dad would be so proud." Elena smiled, typing back, "He is proud. And so am I." That evening, Elena sat in her modest but comfortable apartment near the Stanford campus, a space that felt like home in a way the Nob Hill penthouse never could. The walls were covered with Sophia's artwork from childhood, photographs from Elena's UN career, and Miguel's original sketches for translation algorithms that would serve humanity rather than exploiting it. On her desk was a letter that had arrived that afternoon, handwritten correspondence from Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly asylum seeker whose legal documents Carmen had helped translate. "Dr. Vasquez," the letter read in careful Spanish, "my family and I received word today that our asylum application has been approved. We understand now that we are safe, that our children can attend school, that we can build a life here. Thank you for creating technology that helped us understand the language of hope." Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in a special box where she kept similar correspondence. Messages from families who had navigated complex legal systems, students who had accessed education in multiple languages, medical patients who had received culturally appropriate healthcare because human translators and digital tools had worked together to ensure understanding. Each letter represented a small victory in the larger project of building bridges rather than barriers between cultures. Each success story demonstrated that Miguel's vision of technology serving human dignity was not just idealistic dreaming, but practical reality. Outside her window, San Francisco sparkled with the lights of millions of people speaking dozens of languages, carrying the hopes and dreams that had motivated immigrants for generations. The city that had once seemed to mock Elena's poverty and invisibility now embraced her as a leader in the humanitarian technology movement that was spreading to universities, NGOs, and international development organizations around the world. The ripple effects continued expanding, touching lives in ways that couldn't be measured by corporate profit statements or technological benchmarks. They could only be measured by the most important metric Miguel had ever identified, the number of people whose dignity was enhanced rather than diminished by the tools designed to serve them. Elena opened her laptop and began working on her next day's lecture notes, planning to discuss the difference between technological disruption and technological service, between innovation that enriches inventors and innovation that enriches humanity. The work continued, the bridges kept being built, and Miguel's dream lived on in every perfectly translated word that carried hope across the barriers of language and culture. 1 year later, Elena stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, looking out over delegates from 193 nations, whose conversations she had once facilitated as an invisible interpreter. Today, she was visible in a way Miguel could never have imagined, not as a voice translating other people's words, but as a leader presenting her own vision to the world. The morning light streamed through the vast windows of the assembly hall, illuminating faces that represented every continent, every language family, every cultural tradition that humanity had developed across millennia of civilization. Elena felt the familiar tingle of linguistic anticipation, the mental preparation that preceded complex, multilingual communication. But today, she would be speaking primarily in English, with her words simultaneously interpreted into the 6 official UN languages and dozens of others. "Honorable delegates," Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to command attention through competence rather than volume. "1 year ago, my family's story was a private tragedy, a brilliant scientist's death, a widow's poverty, a daughter's interrupted education. Today, I stand before you to demonstrate how personal justice can become global healing, how individual restoration can create systemic transformation." In the gallery above, Sophia sat with Dr. Patricia Morrison and James Park, watching her mother address the assembly where Elena had once worked as an anonymous facilitator. Sophia wore a Stanford University pin alongside a small pendant containing one of Miguel's original algorithm sketches, a symbol of technological heritage being carried into the next generation. The Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Initiative, Elena continued, has spent the past year proving that humanitarian technology can be both sophisticated and accessible, both innovative and culturally sensitive. Our pilot programs have served over 50,000 refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrant families across 7 countries, with translation accuracy rates that exceed 98% for complex legal and medical documentation. Behind her, the large assembly screen displayed photographs from field operations, medical clinics in Jordan, where Syrian refugees received healthcare in Arabic, translated with perfect cultural context. Legal aid centers in Kenya, where Somali asylum seekers navigated complex immigration processes. Educational programs in Bangladesh, where Rohingya children learned mathematics in their own language while preparing for integration into Bengali-speaking schools. But the true measure of our success, Elena said, advancing to her next slide, is not technological efficiency. It is human dignity restored. It is families who understand their legal rights, patients who can communicate with their doctors, children who can learn in languages that honor their heritage while preparing them for their future. In the French delegation section, Ambassador Marie Dubois raised her hand for recognition. Elena nodded, switching automatically to French as she acknowledged the question. "Professor Vasquez, the French Republic has been following your initiative with great interest. How do you ensure that this technology remains focused on humanitarian applications rather than commercial exploitation?" Elena smiled, appreciating both the question and the opportunity to address one of her core principles in multiple languages. "Excellent question, Ambassador Dubois. We have embedded legal and ethical frameworks directly into our technology architecture. Our algorithms literally cannot process translation requests that involve commercial money transfers, fraudulent documentation, or exploitation of vulnerable populations. We have built conscience into the code itself." She switched to English for the broader assembly. "This represents a fundamental departure from traditional technology development. Instead of asking, can we build this, we ask, should we build this? Instead of optimizing for profit, we optimize for human flourishing. Instead of disrupting human expertise, we amplify human wisdom." The Chinese ambassador spoke next, his question delivered in Mandarin with the formal precision that Elena remembered from diplomatic negotiations. "Dr. Vasquez, How does your initiative address the concern that humanitarian technology might create dependency rather than building local capacity? Elena responded in equally formal Mandarin, demonstrating the linguistic competence that had made her invaluable to international diplomacy. Honorable Ambassador Wu, that concern reflects the core of our philosophical approach. We do not provide translation services to communities. We provide translation tools and training to community members themselves. Our goal is to transfer capability rather than creating dependence. She gestured toward the screen, which now showed photographs of training sessions where former refugees were learning to operate and maintain translation systems in their own communities. In Jordan's Zaatari refugee camp, Syrian teachers now train other refugees to use our educational translation protocols. In Kenya's Kakuma camp, Somali medical interpreters have become certified operators of our healthcare communication systems. We measure success not by the number of translations we provide, but by the number of local translators we empower. Dr. Morrison, watching from the gallery, felt deep satisfaction at seeing Elena's vision articulated on the global stage. The UN Development Programme had invested heavily in the Digital Dignity Initiative precisely because it represented a new paradigm for humanitarian technology, one that built capacity rather than creating dependency, that honored cultural complexity rather than attempting to simplify it away. Elena advanced to her final section, her voice taking on the passionate conviction that had sustained her through 2 years of poverty and humiliation. Distinguished delegates, the technology sector has spent decades promising to connect the world, to break down barriers, to democratize access to information and opportunity. But too often, these promises have benefited those who were already privileged, while marginalizing those who most needed connection and understanding. The assembly hall was completely quiet now, delegates leaning forward with the attention reserved for speakers who were addressing fundamental questions rather than diplomatic pleasantries. The Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Initiative proposes a different vision, Elena continued. Technology that serves the most vulnerable rather than the most profitable. Innovation that preserves cultural richness rather than homogenizing it. Digital tools that amplify human wisdom rather than replacing it with algorithmic approximation. Elena paused, looking out over the assembly where she had once been invisible, where her voice had carried other people's words, but never her own ideas. My husband Miguel believed that every language carries the soul of its people, and that technology should honor that soul, rather than trying to digitize it into ones and zeros. Today, I ask you to support a global framework that makes human dignity, rather than technological efficiency, the measure of innovation's value. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Delegates from across the political spectrum rose in sustained applause, recognizing not just Elena's specific proposals, but the larger principle she represented: technology designed by and for the communities it claimed to serve. Ambassador Adaora Okafor from Nigeria was the first to speak during the response period. Professor Vasquez, Nigeria pledges full support for the Digital Dignity Framework and requests priority consideration for pilot programs in our refugee resettlement regions. Similar commitments followed from delegates representing every continent. The European Union announced a €50 million funding commitment. The Organization of American States proposed making digital dignity principles mandatory for all technology procurement. The African Union requested technical assistance for implementing the framework across member states. Elena felt overwhelmed by the response, but also deeply moved by the recognition that Miguel's vision was being embraced by the global community he had always hoped to serve. After the formal session concluded, Elena found herself surrounded by delegates who wanted to discuss specific implementation strategies, funding mechanisms, and partnership opportunities. but her attention was drawn to a quiet conversation happening near the assembly hall's side entrance. Marcus Blackwood stood with Dr. Hassan and Carmen Martinez, the three of them engaged in what appeared to be a serious but cordial discussion. Elena watched with curiosity as Marcus handed Dr. Hassan what looked like a technical manual, his demeanor respectful in a way that would have been unrecognizable to his former corporate associates. Elena approached the group with the cautious interest of someone who had orchestrated Marcus's downfall, but also supervised his rehabilitation. "Marcus," she said simply, her tone neutral but not hostile. Marcus turned toward her with an expression that combined gratitude, embarrassment, and genuine respect. "Dr. Vasquez, I wanted to thank you for insisting on the educational component of my sentence. Working with Dr. Hassan and Carmen has taught me more about translation than I learned in 5 years of running a translation company." Dr. Hassan nodded approvingly. "Marcus has completed his community service requirements, but he's requested to continue volunteering with our refugee health programs. He's developed some useful technical skills for maintaining our translation equipment." Elena studied Marcus carefully, looking for signs of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized his previous personality. What she saw instead was someone who had been fundamentally changed by sustained exposure to the human consequences of his earlier actions. "What will you do now?" Elena asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his answer clearly reflecting serious consideration. "I've been accepted into a graduate program in humanitarian technology development at UC Berkeley. Dr. Hassan has agreed to supervise a research project on culturally appropriate medical translation protocols." Carmen smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine transformation. Marcus understands now that technology is only as valuable as the people it serves. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that justice had achieved its intended purpose of education rather than mere punishment. "Miguel always believed that understanding was more powerful than revenge," she said finally. "I hope your work honors the communities you once exploited." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I'll spend the rest of my career trying to earn that honor." As the afternoon concluded and delegates began departing for their home countries, carrying commitments to implement digital dignity principles, Elena found herself alone in the assembly hall, where her career had begun decades earlier. The vast space echoed with the memory of thousands of conversations she had facilitated, millions of words she had translated, countless moments when precise communication had prevented misunderstanding and conflict. Sophia joined her on the assembly floor, carrying the leather portfolio that Elena had used during her UN interpreting days, now repurposed to hold Miguel's original research notes and the legal documents that had restored his intellectual property rights. "Dad would have loved this," Sophia said, looking up at the assembly hall's soaring ceiling and flags representing every nation on Earth. Elena wrapped her arm around her daughter, feeling the continuity that connected Miguel's original vision to Sophia's generation of humanitarian technologists. "He's here," she said simply. "Every time someone uses our technology to understand rather than exploit, every time a refugee receives culturally appropriate medical care, every time a child learns in a language that honors their heritage, Dad is here." They stood together in the hall where Elena had learned that language was the bridge between cultures, where she had discovered that translation was about more than words, where she had developed the expertise that would eventually bring justice to her family and service to the world. The late afternoon sun streamed through the assembly hall's windows, casting long shadows that reminded Elena of another morning in a penthouse kitchen, where she had cleaned floors while listening to criminals plan to exploit the very communities she now served. The contrast between that morning of invisible servitude and this afternoon of visible leadership represented more than personal transformation. It represented the difference between technology that served power and technology that served justice. Elena pulled out her phone and typed a message to the global network of translators, programmers, and humanitarian workers who had joined the Digital Dignity Initiative. Today, the UN voted unanimously to adopt the Miguel Vasquez Digital Dignity Framework as international policy. Tomorrow we begin the real work of implementing technology that honors human dignity around the world. The responses came immediately from Jordan, Kenya, Bangladesh, and dozens of other locations where former refugees, immigrant communities, and local translators were using technology to build bridges rather than barriers between cultures. As Elena and Sophia left the United Nations building, stepping out into the New York evening where millions of people spoke dozens of languages and carried the hopes that had motivated immigrants for generations, Elena felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that Miguel's legacy was secure, that their daughter's future was bright, and that justice had created not just personal restoration but global transformation. The work continued. The bridges kept being built, and in every perfectly translated word that carried hope across the barriers of language and culture, Miguel's dream lived on. Technology serving humanity, innovation honoring dignity, and love transcending the boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. Elena looked up at the UN building's illuminated windows, where delegates from around the world were making phone calls in dozens of languages, planning implementation strategies that would bring digital dignity to communities that had waited too long for technology designed to serve them rather than exploit them. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning, and so ends the story of Dr. Elena Vasquez, who discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply being seen and heard by those who had dismissed you as invisible. In a world that often mistakes efficiency for innovation and disruption for progress, Elena and Miguel's legacy reminds us that the highest technology serves the most vulnerable, the best translation preserves cultural richness. And the greatest revolution happens when those who were overlooked finally step into the light where they belong. What aspect of Elena's journey resonated most with you? What moment made you believe that justice was truly possible? Share your thoughts, because stories like Elena's are all around us, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that every language carries the soul of its people, and every person deserves to be understood.